Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a stack of really fascinating information you've shared with us. It's all about poverty in India. We've got reports, analyses, data points. It paints a picture that is, well, anything but simple.
Hmm.
The big headline jumping out at everyone lately, it seems incredibly positive. Massive numbers of people reportedly lifted out of extreme poverty. On the surface, it sounds like this huge, undeniable victory.
And it is a significant claim. I mean, you hear numbers like that, it absolutely warrants a deep look. But you're right, with any set of, big numbers and sweeping declarations, there's always a layer of complexity underneath. Questions pop up, different perspectives clash.
Right.
And the finer details, well, that's often where the real story lies, isn't it?
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is really to get past that headline number. We want to unpack these figures, understand the different viewpoints on what's actually happening on the ground, and figure out what these shifts or maybe the debates about these shifts genuinely mean for, hundreds of millions of lives across India.
Yeah, it's about seeing the full landscape, not just the highest peak they're pointing to.
It's about digging into the nuance. Let's get started then. Let's dive into those headline numbers first, because they really are striking. You called it almost like a vanishing act being reported for extreme poverty.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because the figures are dramatic.
Yeah.
Recent reports we've looked at suggest a truly remarkable drop in extreme poverty. We're talking about the international definition here, living on less than $2.15 a day.
Okay, the $2.15 line.
Right. And remember, the $2.15 isn't just like the direct exchange rate. It's adjusted for purchasing power parity.
Ah, right, PPP. So it's about what that money can actually buy in India versus elsewhere.
Exactly. It tries to level the playing field. So $2.15 should theoretically buy you roughly the same basic stuff in India as it would in the U.S. It's how we try to compare poverty across different economies.
Got it. Standardizes the buying power. So what do these reports show for India using that standard?
They show, well, a plummet. If you look back to, say, 2011, the data indicated 22.5% of Indians were below this $2.15 line.
22.5%. Okay.
Fast forward to 2022-23, and that figure is reported down to just 2.3%.
Wow. That's a massive percentage drop in just over a decade.
It is.
What does that translate to in terms of actual people? Millions.
Oh, yeah, millions.
No.
Staggering numbers, really. It means a reported 171 million people have moved out of extreme poverty by this specific measure over that period. To give you an idea of the scale in Indian terms, estimates suggest it's down from about 23 crore people, that's 230 million,
Right.
to just 3.3 crore people, or 33 million by one estimate in 2024. That's a huge reduction in the absolute numbers.
And is this, concentrated in one area, or is it seen across the board?
The reports indicate the improvement is widespread. Both rural and urban areas saw big drops. Rural poverty reportedly fell from 18.4% down to 2.8%,
Okay.
and urban from 10.7% down to a very low 1.1%. So it's not just, one pocket of progress. It seems to be pretty broad, according to these figures.
Okay, that's the $2.15 line, which is often used for the lowest level of extreme poverty. But India's a lower middle income country. Is there a different international standard, maybe more relevant for that category?
There is, yeah, and it's an important one to consider. The World Bank uses a $3.65 a day line for lower middle income countries like India.
Right, a higher bar.
Exactly. And if we look at the numbers using that higher threshold, the reduction is also pretty impressive, actually. Poverty at the $3.65 line reduced from 61.8% back in 2011.
Whoa, over 60% then.
Yeah, a huge majority, down to 28.1% in 2022-23.
Okay, still significant progress.
Definitely. That means lifting an additional 378 million people out of that specific category of poverty.
Yeah.
So massive numbers again.
So still nearly 30%, or about 400 million people, below that $3.65 line by recent estimates. But yeah, substantial progress compared to 2011. And I understand this sort of positive picture is backed up by some of India's own official data, too.
Correct. The government's Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, the HCES, for 2022-23, it estimates the national poverty rate somewhere between 2.8 crore, that's 28 million, and 7 crore, 70 million people.
Okay.
Compare that to the 2011 figure of 26 crore, or 260 million. You see a really dramatic drop in the official estimates as well.
And even institutions like the State Bank of India, they've weighed in.
They did. Yeah, SBI put out its own report. They put the recent national poverty rate even lower, around 4 to 4.5%. They actually did something interesting. They adjusted their own poverty lines for inflation, nudging them up a bit.
Okay, what did they adjust them to?
Their calculation came out to roughly 54 rupees per day for rural areas and 64 rupees for urban areas to not be considered poor by their adjusted standard.
54, 64 rupees a day. We'll come back to whether that's enough. Okay, so the headline numbers, they definitely paint a very positive picture of shrinking extreme poverty based on these current definitions and standards. But here's where, as we said, things get much more complex and, frankly, pretty hotly debated. It brings us right to the very definition of poor in India. Is that line drawn in the sand, or is it more like, shifting sand that changes who gets counted?
Oh, it's absolutely shifting sand. And it's probably the most crucial point of discussion here. For years, India's official poverty count has largely relied on something called the Tendulkar poverty line. This was set way back in 2009.
2009, okay.
Yeah. And this line defined poverty as living on just 816 rupees a month for rural areas. So that's about 27 rupees a day.
27 rupees a day. Wow.
And 1,000 rupees a month for urban areas, roughly 33 rupees a day.
Ours 27 or ours 33 a day? I mean, even back then maybe, but in today's economy, that feels incredibly low.
And that's precisely the core issue many experts raise. A benchmark set in 2009 feels significantly outdated for India's economy today. Just think about how much basic costs, transport, vegetables, maybe a doctor's visit, how much they've risen since then.
Right.
Using a line from 15 years ago feels like trying to measure modern living standards with, I don't know, a ruler from a different era. It just doesn't quite fit.
I seem to remember there was a committee. Didn't they try to update this a while back?
Yes, exactly. The Redrawing committee in 2014, they proposed higher lines, 972 rupees rural and 4,407 urban. That worked out to roughly 32 and 47 rupees a day.
Okay, slightly higher, but still sounds pretty low.
Still quite low, yeah. But even those recommendations weren't officially adopted. India largely stuck with the older Tendulkar line for its official counts until, this recent HCES data and these other reports like SBI's started using slightly different or adjusted lines.
And even the SBI's adjusted lines, the R's 54.64 a day, they face criticism.
They do. Because while adjusting for inflation is absolutely necessary, critics still question if 54 or even 64 rupees per day is genuinely adequate for more than just bare-bones survival in today's India, especially in cities.
Yeah, I mean, can you really afford healthcare if you get sick? Can your kids get a decent education? What if your roof leaks?
Exactly. Can you handle any unexpected expense? A single bus fare or buying a few basic household items could eat up a huge chunk of that daily amount pretty quickly.
And this isn't just some academic debate about different numbers, is it? This line, it has huge real-world consequences.
Massive consequences. The poverty line is the direct yardstick for government aid eligibility. It literally determines who gets access to critical welfare programs, free food, subsidies, healthcare support, you name it.
So a low line means fewer people qualify.
Potentially, yes. Critics argue that a line set too low, based on maybe outdated costs, might exclude millions of people who are still struggling significantly. They might be technically not poor by that old standard, but they're still very much deprived of basic needs and opportunities in reality.
And when we look back at those international lines again, that World Bank $3.65 line still showed 28.1% of Indians were poor in 2022-23. That's, about 400 million people? That's a huge contrast to the sub 5% figures being cited by SBI or based on the adjusted lines.
It really puts the debate into perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And if you were to apply the $6.85 line, which is used for upper middle income countries and maybe reflects a higher standard of living to aspire to,
Right.
the number of people considered poor in India would be even higher. The number you get is profoundly dependent on where you decide to draw that line. It changes everything.
Okay, so leaving the line debate aside just for a moment, if we focus on the progress against the current definitions, particularly that dramatic drop in the $2.15 poverty, how did India reportedly manage this? What's the explanation according to the sources we looked at? What was the secret sauce?
Well, it appears to be a mix, but heavily weighted towards government intervention and also just sustained economic momentum. Welfare programs are consistently highlighted as absolutely key drivers. We're talking about massive schemes, like the one providing free food grains, wheat, and rice to about 2/3 of the population.
2/3? That's enormous.
It's huge. This isn't some small program. It's a critical safety net providing basic sustenance for hundreds of millions.
So direct provisioning of essentials, basically.
Exactly. And it goes beyond food. There's the Ayushman Bharat scheme, which provides healthcare coverage and affordable medicines through the Yojana. These programs kind of catch people before they fall into the most extreme levels of deprivation by ensuring access to basic necessities.
So they create a floor.
Sort of, yeah. The SPI report, for instance, specifically credits higher consumption growth among the poorest segments, partly to these government handouts. It's like providing a foundational level of security that lifts people just above those lowest thresholds.
And what about the broader economy? Did growth play a part?
Economic growth also plays a role, definitely.
Uh-huh.
Looking at the data, per capita consumption basically, how much the average person is spending it, has been growing annually since 2011-12. It was around 2.9% growth overall per year, with rural areas actually seeing slightly higher growth than urban.
Okay.
Now, that's not like hypergrowth, but this sustained increase in spending power over a decade does trickle down to some extent and contributes to lifting incomes over time.
And was there any shift in how wealth or consumption is distributed? Did inequality change?
Well, sources do mention a decrease in measured inequality when looking specifically at consumption. They cite a drop in the Gini coefficient for both urban and rural areas.
The Gini coefficient. Remind us.
Right, it's a measure economists use to track inequality. 0 means perfect equality, everyone has the same. 1 means one person has everything. So a drop suggests consumption is spread a bit more evenly than before.
Okay, a bit more evenly.
Yeah, although we'll definitely get to this later, but wealth inequality tells a very, very different story. But for consumption, a slight decrease was reported.
Okay, so welfare programs providing a safety net, economic growth providing some upward movement, those seem to be the main factors credited for the reported reduction. But of course, there's always a but. There are complexities around the data itself, aren't there? How are these numbers actually being counted? Is there a potential for data magic or maybe methodological quirks influencing the outcome?
There absolutely are questions about the data. The primary source for these poverty estimates is that Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, the HCES. It tracks what households spend. But the HCES, while it's foundational, it has faced methodological scrutiny over the years.
What kind of issues? What are people pointing to?
Well, one significant point is the survey's use of something called the Modified Mixed Reference Period, or MMRP.
MMRP.
Yeah, basically it means that for different types of items, say food items versus durable goods like furniture or clothing, the survey asks people to recall their spending over different time periods. Some might be 7 days, some 30 days, some even 365 days for less frequent purchases.
Ah, okay. So they're mixing how far back people have to remember things.
Exactly. And mixing these recall periods can make direct apples-to-apples comparisons with older survey data, which might have used different recall methods, quite difficult.
Right. You're not comparing like with like anymore.
Precisely. It introduces this layer of complexity when you're trying to analyze trends over a decade or more. You're not always measuring the exact same thing in the exact same way.
So changes in the survey method itself could actually influence the perceived trend, make poverty reduction look bigger or smaller than it really is.
That's the concern critics raise.
Yeah.
They worry that changes in the survey's design or how it selects households or even subtle changes in questioning might affect the results. This could potentially lead to understating real inequality or, conversely, overstating the actual poverty reduction when comparing across different survey years. You have to be really careful.
And is it possible the survey isn't capturing everyone equally? Like, are some groups harder to reach?
Yes, that's another known challenge with household surveys pretty much everywhere, actually. Wealthier households are often harder to reach, they might be less likely to respond, or maybe their full spending patterns aren't always captured accurately.
Mm-hmm.
So if the richest segments are consistently underrepresented, it can make overall inequality look less severe than it truly is. It can skew the picture.
You mentioned the free food programs earlier. How does getting food for free affect a survey that's measuring spending?
Ah, yeah, that's a crucial nuance.
Yeah.
Welfare programs that provide benefits in kind, like those free food grains,
Yeah.
they aren't always fully captured in reported consumption spending data.
Because people aren't spending money on it.
Exactly. They're receiving it, not buying it.
Mm-hmm.
So sources point out that this means the actual level of material deprivation might be even lower than the consumption figures alone suggest.
Because people are better off in reality. They have the food.
Right. They're getting essential goods they don't have to pay for. However, the official poverty line is often based on reported consumption spending. So while people might be better off in a real sense, the spending data might not fully reflect that improvement. It's a measurement issue.
Okay, so we have these impressive headline numbers, factors like welfare programs and growth cited as drivers, but also these valid questions about how the data is collected and interpreted. It definitely sounds like not everyone is convinced this is a straightforward victory celebration.
Definitely not. There's a strong skeptics corner regarding these figures. Some experts are urging caution, saying let's wait for the full, unit-level data from the 2022-23 HCES to be released so it could be properly scrutinized.
They want to see the raw data, not just the summary.
Exactly. There's a concern, maybe unspoken sometimes, that the emphasis on the aggregate positive numbers and maybe the timing of their release might be influenced by political considerations, especially given recent national elections.
That makes sense. Data can certainly be presented in a specific light depending on the goals. What are some of the specific counter-arguments or alternative ways of looking at this poverty picture?
Well, as we touched on earlier, the biggest counter-argument circles right back to the poverty line itself. It's the fundamental issue for many. Some economists argue quite forcefully that if you were to set a poverty line that actually reflects today's cost of living in India, particularly in urban areas, the poverty rate would be drastically higher than the figures being reported. One estimate I saw suggested it could be as high as 40 to 60% by a more contemporary realistic standard.
40 to 60%. Wow, that's a stark contrast to the 5% figures being highlighted.
It is. It just shows how much the definition matters. It's like, claiming you finish a marathon when maybe you only ran the first 5K. Where you put the finish line changes everything.
And poverty isn't just about how much money you spend, right? What about looking at it from a different angle entirely? Are there other measures?
Absolutely. And this is critical. The Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI, offers a really important alternative perspective. It looks beyond just income or consumption. It includes measures of health, education, and living standards, things like access to clean water, sanitation, nutrition, years of schooling for kids.
So a broader view of well-being.
Exactly. A recent MPI report indicated that 234 million Indians were still considered multidimensionally poor in 2022.
234 million. That's a much larger number than the recent monetary estimates based on those low lines.
Much larger. And it highlights that even if people manage to get just above a very low monetary line, they might still lack basic services and capabilities that are essential for a life with, real dignity and opportunity.
And what about inequality? You mentioned consumption inequality decreased slightly, but the overall picture.
Inequality remains a huge, perhaps even growing issue. And the wealth distribution data paints a very, very different picture from consumption. Reports indicate that the top 1% of Indians hold a massively disproportionate share of the nation's wealth. Figures around, I think, 73% of wealth generated going to the top 1% have been cited in some reports.
73%?
Yeah, while the bottom half of the population has seen minimal wealth growth. This extreme concentration of wealth means that the benefits of India's overall economic growth just aren't being distributed evenly at all.
So it's like everyone's at a big feast, but a tiny fraction of the guests are getting almost all the food, even if the crumbs are slightly bigger than before for others.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually.
Yeah. And bringing it back to that poverty line, the critics' core point seems to be that a line set at, say, RS-54 or RS-64 a day might prevent the most extreme forms of starvation. But it's arguably insufficient for a life with dignity or opportunity or the ability to genuinely participate in a growing economy.
That's the heart of it. That's the pushback. They advocate for adopting higher international standards, like the $3.65 or even the $6.85 lines, as more appropriate benchmarks for a rapidly developing country like India. Defining not poor by barely surviving just sets a very low bar for a country with India's scale, aspirations, and frankly, its potential.
It's clear this isn't a problem that just appeared overnight, though. To really understand where India is today, we need to look back a bit, don't we? There's a definite historical hangover impacting the present.
Oh, without question. You really can't talk about poverty in India without acknowledging its deep historical roots. Colonial rule, for instance, is widely seen as having fundamentally reshaped and in many ways damaged India's economy over a long period.
How so?
Well, it turned India largely into a supplier of raw materials, while simultaneously crushing local industries with cheaper imports from Britain. This led to a significant drain of wealth over centuries. It created structural disadvantages, inequalities that the country is still grappling with today.
And then after independence in 1947, there were huge internal hurdles right from the start.
Absolutely. India inherited a fragmented economy, incredibly high population density, widespread illiteracy across massive parts of the country, and severely underdeveloped infrastructure, roads, power, communication. These were immense foundational challenges that complicated the path to development and poverty reduction for decades. It wasn't an easy starting point.
And today, those historical issues may be combined with newer challenges. They manifest in specific ways and maybe in specific regions more than others.
They do. You see specific regions continuing to face really deeply entrenched poverty. States like Bihar are often highlighted as remaining very poor.
Why Bihar, for instance?
Well, it's attributed to a combination of persistent factors, things like very high population growth rates putting pressure on resources, historically low levels of education, which perpetuate cycles of disadvantage, and sometimes governance issues that can impede effective development initiatives reaching the ground. It's like a compounding effect of multiple challenges in one place.
And natural disasters must also play a recurring role, I imagine, especially in certain areas.
Tragically, yes. Geography makes certain regions incredibly vulnerable. Natural disasters like the severe floods that are common in states like Assam and Bihar, they can just devastate livelihoods overnight. They destroy homes, crops, infrastructure, and can push millions of people who are maybe just barely above the poverty line right back into it very quickly. It's a constant threat.
And social inequalities, things like caste and gender, they remain deeply intertwined with poverty, don't they?
Fundamentally so. Social inequalities, including historical caste discrimination and persistent gender gaps, continue to significantly limit access to resources, education, and economic opportunities for large segments of the population. Data shows, for example, a huge percentage of Indian women are outside the formal workforce, often due to the societal expectations and the burden of caregiving responsibilities falling disproportionately on them.
Right.
And caste barriers, sadly, still perpetuate generational poverty for many marginalized groups, limiting their ability to access land, good jobs, quality education, all the things you need to escape poverty.
So it's this complex web of historical, social, and economic factors all kind of feeding into each other and creating these persistent challenges. And you even mentioned global factors potentially coming into play.
Yes, the sources mention that too. Things like the structure of the global economy, international trade imbalances, and maybe policies that sometimes disproportionately favor wealthier nations. These can make it harder for developing countries like India to build competitive industries and fully break free from systemic poverty traps on a global scale. It's another layer.
Okay, bringing all of this together, the reported dramatic progress against one definition, the significant questions about the definition itself and the data, the weight of history and these ongoing challenges, it really brings us back to the core question. Is it time for India to change how it defines poverty? Is the road ahead primarily about, acknowledging the progress made against the old standard, or is it about establishing a new, more relevant one?
Well, there is definitely a growing call for redefining the poverty line. It seems to be gaining momentum, adopting a higher standard, perhaps aligning with those international benchmarks like the $3.65 or even the $6.85 would undeniably paint a clearer, maybe more realistic picture of the number of people who are still struggling in India's rapidly growing economy.
Struggling even if they're not in that extreme, life-threatening deprivation anymore.
Exactly, struggling to achieve a decent standard of living, not just survive.
And what could changing the definition actually achieve? What would be the practical benefit?
Well, beyond just having a more accurate picture, raising the line could actually compel policymakers to improve the targeting of aid and welfare programs. India has this impressive digital infrastructure now, the Aadhaar identity system, mobile phone penetration, the Jan Dhan bank accounts, often called the JAM Trinity.
Right, the digital stack.
Yeah, that can be leveraged more effectively by having a clearer picture of who is truly struggling by a contemporary standard. Aid could theoretically be directed more efficiently, reducing leakage and ensuring benefits reach those who need them most instead of maybe being spread too thin or captured by others.
And what about that multidimensional approach you mentioned earlier, the MPI?
Adopting a multidimensional approach like the MPI, more formally, perhaps alongside monetary measures, is also seen as really key by many analysts. It shifts the focus beyond just ensuring basic subsistence, like enough calories, towards actively improving people's health outcomes, their educational attainment, and their overall living standards. Clean water, sanitation, housing.
So it's about empowerment, not just income.
Precisely. It's about empowering people with the capabilities and opportunities they need to genuinely thrive, not just survive day to day.
But politically, officially saying, actually, more people are poor by this new definition. That must be incredibly difficult for any government, right?
Oh, it's a significant political challenge, no doubt about it. Raising the official poverty line means acknowledging that a higher percentage of the population is considered poor by a more contemporary standard. That could be politically sensitive, especially when a government is trying to highlight its achievements in poverty reduction based on the older, lower lines.
Yeah, using the $3.65 line, for example, immediately puts the poverty rate back up around 28% in those recent estimates. That's a much harder number to sell as a victory than 25%.
Exactly. It changes the narrative completely.
But then again, sticking with an outdated low line has its own risks, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Celebrating reaching a low bar that was set, 15 years ago, it risks complacency. It might lead to overlooking millions who still lack access to essential health care, quality education, decent housing, or opportunities for skills development needs that go far beyond just securing enough food for the day. You might stop addressing the needs of those just above the old line.
So, looking ahead then, what does this mean for actually addressing poverty in India? What's the path forward?
Well, it probably means that existing targeted programs like the Big Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, MGNRAGS, they're still vital safety nets, but they might need to adapt or be better targeted. Fundamentally, however, many argue that truly sustainable poverty reduction, the kind that really empowers people, requires significant long-term investment in their human capital.
Yeah.
Meaning better quality education right from the start, comprehensive skills training that's actually aligned with the needs of the modern economy, and robust, accessible healthcare systems for everyone. This really aligns with that broader idea of development as freedom. The concept that development isn't just about GDP growth numbers, but about expanding people's capabilities and freedoms to live the kind of lives they value.
Wow, that really is a lot to unpack. On one hand, those numbers showing millions lifted from extreme poverty, particularly by that $2.15 line, they are substantial. You can't ignore them. They point to real improvements for a huge segment of the population, likely driven, as you said, by those significant welfare programs and underlying economic shifts.
No, you absolutely can't dismiss that. I mean, improved conditions, even basic ones, for over 100 million people is a profound achievement in itself.
But then, on the other hand, this intense debate around where the poverty line should actually be drawn, the legitimate concerns about the data's methodology and maybe its completeness, and these persistent, deep challenges of inequality, both wealth and opportunity, and that multidimensional deprivation, these factors remind us that the picture is far, far more complex than a single dramatic percentage drop can really capture.
Yeah, it shows that the journey is definitely not over. And maybe defining the goalpost, defining what not poor really means, is itself a huge part of the ongoing challenge.
It seems like India has indeed made significant strides, particularly against that historical definition of extreme poverty, but perhaps the definition of the finish line itself needs to evolve, needs to be updated to truly reflect the reality and maybe the aspirations of a rapidly growing 21st century economy.
I think the conversation is shifting, or at least it needs to shift, from just ensuring mere survival towards enabling true dignity, capability, and real opportunity for everyone.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, here's maybe a thought to consider. In a country like India, with a rapidly growing economy and, significant global ambitions, what should the definition of not poor truly encompass today? Is it enough to simply be surviving on, say, $2 or $3 a day? Or should it mean having genuine access to the opportunities, the resources, and the standards of living needed to truly thrive in the modern world?